Welcome back to Decoding the Conflict Mindset. Dr. Deborah Dupree, the Mindset Doc. You are in for one of the most exciting and fantastic interviews I think I've done to date. Now, I've had many great speakers, but when you start listening to Dov Baron, you are going to gain so much. He has worked with leaders of major Fortune 500 companies to really help them confront what's been getting in their way. He's identified and developed what he calls the emotional source code, sort of like our emotional DNA. And with that, he's got a fascinating story of how he began. Growing up in poverty in England, going on to excel and become a Jungian psychologist. He studied the psychology of excellence and later dovetailed into quantum physics and neuroscience, something we both have a passion for. What's even more important, he's taken his work to sort of examine, maybe further analyze a little bit about some very top leaders. Listen to what he has to say about Putin from Russia. What about Donald Trump? And of course, the infamous events of January 6th. What he likes to call, our message is driven by our emotional source code. What is that for America? Freedom. You threaten that, and we're bound to fight. So please don't go away. Fascinating interview to your friends, colleagues, wherever. And join me as I welcome Dov Baron in just a few moments. Remember to subscribe. That way you'll be first in line to hear each and every new podcast as it's released. Well, here we are. Welcome to Decoding the Conflict Mindset. I'm Dr. Deborah Dupree, the host and founder of Decoding the Conflict Mindset. One of the delights I have in running a program like this are the amazing speakers I get an opportunity to meet, learn, and dive deeper with. And that's no exception for today's guest, Dov Baron. Welcome, Dov.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Pleasure and honor to be here. I'm looking forward to serving you and the audience.
Wonderful, wonderful. I know we have lots to learn from you. And so I'm particularly intrigued by your key message, the emotional source code. And I know for any of my followers, they know I'm always talking about the emotional drivers behind people in conflict and trying to decode that and help people understand the layers that go on and how we're neurobiologically triggered in that. So I'm curious. I know my journey, and again, a lot of our program followers are aware of that, but let's hear your trigger, your journey into this whole world.
Thank you. I appreciate you asking. First thing I want to say is I appreciate that you are recognizing conflict as multi-layered, because oftentimes when there's a lot of people out there teaching how to deal with conflict by teaching you a strategy. And that's great. The strategies are good. But if you don't understand the layers that are driving it from underneath, you're going to keep hitting the wall with great strategies. I mean, the strategies are fabulous, but they won't work for you. And you go, is it me? Well, it kind of is, but not because you're an idiot, not because you don't understand. It's because those layers that you talked about. So we'll get into those. And thank you for asking about my journey, because it is let's say a long and winding road, to use Paul McCartney's words. Yes, I was born in abject poverty in northern England, surrounded by crime, violence, addiction, abuse, all kinds of lovely stuff. Made a commitment at 14 to leave where I was born, but had my awakening probably my first awakening when I was about 7, almost 8. My mother freaked my mother out, and she thought maybe I was possessed and that my head was going to spin and I was going to vomit green stuff. So I was shipped off to the rabbis to study, and that was the beginning of my journey. So I studied very early Jewish mysticism, and then by the time I was 10, I taught myself prana yoga. And then I traveled the world to study different religious philosophies. So metaphysical background, studied Kabbalah, Vedanta, which is Hindu philosophy, Buddhism, the Tao, Gnostic and Coptic Christianity, and all kinds of other sort of sideline religious stuff. Found myself frustrated with people who could tell me which way my chakra was spinning, but couldn't get their shit together. So I don't know if you can say that word on here. Couldn't get their poo in a pile to hold down a job or a relationship, and they were terrified of conflict. So I was like, yeah, this is not good. So I started studying Jungian psychology. I'm a polymath, which means I'm a person who studies multiple things at the same time and some things consecutively. So while I was doing all this, I ran businesses on 3 different continents. So I have a business background too. So I started becoming a Jungian therapist. I became a Jungian therapist and got really sick of people moaning, whining, and complaining and not doing anything. So I then started studying what was called the psychology of excellence. This is the early 80s. Today, that's called leadership. These were people who were athletes, entertainers, CEOs, and I found a lot of them to be a kind of soulless. And so it was like this was a dilemma for me. It was like, the spiritual people can't get it together. The successful people have got it together, but they're kind of soulless. Like, what's going on? And then in 1983, I stumbled into the world of quantum physics and neuroscience. Now, let me be clear, nobody was talking about quantum physics at a other than in a science lab, and neuroscience was in its very early stages. We were talking about what crosses the blood-brain barrier. We were talking about cortisol, some of those kinds of things. I was biohacking, experimenting with different things to try and get across the blood-brain barrier. That work and my frustration with it made me realize how much of a polymath I was, that these things have to come together. And that is how I came up with the emotional source code. I realized, as you talked about at the beginning, it's multi-layered. It's not a simple answer. It is a depth of answer. And at every layer, there is a gatekeeper. At every layer, there's a protective mechanism that says, whoa, okay, let's not mess with this. Right? This is how we do things around here, inside of our own psychology. So that was the beginning of that journey, a very long and winding road.
Well, I find it fascinating, Dov, as far as some of the parallels. Certainly, different continents we grew up on, and some different factors. But some of the parallels in terms of the ages in which we found ourselves stumbling on. This doesn't seem right, because I was also 7 or 8 when I first started questioning. My dad didn't like that, and
it's not usually a popular thing to do when you're that age. But you're questioning my authority? You're a kid?
Right.
I don't think so.
Right.
Children are meant to be seen and not heard.
That's the message I grew up with. Yes, and I use it all the time when I present. Yes. And so it is really about finding that voice and having a choice. And so it's and then again, going into our teenage years and into college, and some of the search that I did as well, because I traveled to Turkey and spent time with some of the Sufis and things like that. Yeah,
Rumi's work and all that. I studied Rumi. I love all that stuff. That's beautiful.
Yeah. And I also started yoga at a very young age, when people thought, what are you doing? So interesting parallels.
Yeah, definitely parallels there. I think I'll meet you under the crystal ball.
There we go. Somewhere out there. We will meet again.
Somewhere out there, yeah.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about what you have found to be the emotional source code.
So when I studied psychology, it all, there were certainly different, you know this better than most, different fields of psychology and different theories around psychology, Jungian, Freudian, Adlerian, whatever term one wants to use. And I found that all of them have value. I found the most complete to be Jungian. That's why I became a Jungian therapist. But there were pieces that were not tied to the present in a way that they tied to the past, but not to the present. And I found that a lot of this positive psychology is very tied to the present, but it kind of ignores the past, and that doesn't work either. So what I discovered was that the emotional source code, and as you know, Deborah, I wrote an emotional source code profile on Vladimir Putin when he invaded the Ukraine, because people were like, the leaders and icons that I lead were reaching out to me going, why would he do this? This doesn't make any sense. So I wrote that and I made it available. You can find it on my website, dovbaron.com, as a pop-up. I did one on Trump in 2015, and I said he will win the election. I also did one on the United States, and I did one on England, because emotional source code exists for individuals, It exists for organizations or groups, and it also exists for nations. Now, the interesting thing about an emotional source code is we unconsciously follow it. So I'm going to break it down for you, but I want to give you a way to understand it first of all. So let's think about a particular date. Let's go to January the 6th. You know exactly what year I'm talking about. January 6th, if you're in the United States or you've ever had any knowledge of the United States, you know exactly what that date is. Now, you looked at that day and you went, these, maybe not necessarily, but maybe you went, these are a bunch of crazy people. Now, were there crazies there? Absolutely. But guess what? There's crazies in your church, there's crazies in your supermarket, there's crazies in any group. So are there crazies there? Sure. But the majority of people were not crazy. So people say to me, well, okay, as an analyst of these political things, of if they weren't crazy, what were they? And I said they were driven by the emotional source code. So one of my quotes is, the person who controls the meaning controls the movement, right? So the meaning determines the movement. So the group that was controlling, the person who was controlling that group accessed the emotional source code of the country, of the nation of the United States. Now, I'm not saying it was conscious or unconscious. I'm just saying they were able to do it. So if I was to say to you, Deborah, right now, if you were to boil the emotional source code, if you were to boil down America into a single word that is in the psyche of Americans and how they see their country, not in the present tense, forever, since the US has been around, what do you think that word would be? What word would
the
you
word
pick?
the word that comes up to me immediately is rights, and therefore righteousness.
So rights and righteousness. That's interesting because that's an offshoot. So the word that is the emotional source code for Americans is the word freedom. Freedom. It's the reason the Jeep is so popular, because it goes off-road. It's freedom. So if you want to drive America to do something, you're always accessing freedom. Now, how do you move people in a negative manner? You threaten their freedom. You say, they are going to take our freedom. They're going to do this. Now, it's interesting because all that happened, January 6th happened, right? Because there was a threat of, the elections were illegal, blah, blah, blah. Now it's saying that person who said all those things is also trying to take away the freedom of the people who voted. So it's just as energized. Just as energized. It's not violent, but it's just as energized, because that's the key. So once you know the emotional source code of an organization, of a nation, or of an individual, you know what actually unconsciously drives them. So now let's break down the emotional source code into what it is. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
So you know this as well as I do, that people will awaken and realize, this behavior I've got is kind of shitty. It's maybe doing damage in my marriage or in my business or with my kids. I got to change this behavior, right? I got to stop drinking, or I got to stop, screaming at people, or whatever it might be. And so they go to a positive psychology therapist, and they try and get some work, and they do some cognitive work, and they discipline themselves to change. And they do, briefly. But the problem is the fuel that's underneath has not gone away. So now the urge is there. So they are what we used to term, you and I will remember this term, they are now dry drunks, meaning they're not got the alcohol in them, but all the other crap that drove that is still there. So they're still full of venom and all the rest of it. They're trying to change the behavior. They want to change the behavior, but it isn't changing. So they said to me, Dov, why isn't it changing? I'm doing the things. Because you're at a behavioral level. That's the top level. So what's driving the behavior, Dov? Well, that's your beliefs and value system. Oh, so we're going to address the beliefs and values. Yes. Okay. Well, so we do that work. Is that going to change me? Well, actually, no. It will, but not permanently. Oh. So first of all, you've got to, as you said, find your voice, have a choice. So you've got to find out, well, what are my beliefs? What are my values? And that's a journey in and of itself, because most of us are holding beliefs and values that we adopted or that were indoctrinated into us, but they're not really ours. If I say to you, are you a Christian? You say, yes. I say, why? Not because you shouldn't be, but why? Right? Not because you should be, but why? If you say you're a Jew or Muslim or anything else, I would say the same thing. So it's this going deeper into those values and looking at the beliefs, because most of them are indoctrinated. So you go, okay, well, I've done that. Is that working? Well, it is, but not permanently. It is, it's a better change than the behavioral, but it's not that. Okay, so what is it then, Dov? It's the identity. It's the identity you hold. So I just wrote I realize you won't be listening to this as we record it, but you'll be able to listen to it and you'll be able to go back into LinkedIn, because I just wrote a piece around how identity determines what's impossible. If something's impossible, it's in direct conflict with your identity. That's all. So if your identity says, I can't do that, then you can't do it. It's impossible. Shift your identity and you can do many things that you don't think you can do. But the identity we'll come back to in a moment. Below the identity is what's called the anatomy of meaning. That's the meaning you gave to your circumstance or was given to you about your circumstance. And at the bottom of that is the emotional source code. That's kind of like your emotional DNA. But when we used to, and again, this is, you'll understand this, Deborah, we used to believe in the primacy of DNA. We used to think that everything's determined by your DNA. If you've got this in your DNA, well, of course you're a shitbag, because that's what happens. Well, that we know that's not true. We now know, and some of us have known this since the 70s, that it's epigenetic. It's what your DNA is marinating in, and what it's marinating in is the neurochemistry that is released from different parts of your brain, the pineal gland, or any of the other parts of the brain, that are flooding the system and determining what that DNA, whether it turns on or off, because DNA has switches. Okay, so these events have happened. They've given you the emotional DNA. You've marinated in that DNA, and that's given you the anatomy of meaning. It's giving you the meaning, and that's a feedback loop. So the meaning feeds the DNA, feeds the emotional DNA, fuels the emotional source code, and the emotional source code reinforces it. Let me give you a simple example as you're listening. So for a moment, just consider this. I want you to imagine that you walk down the street and you see a drug addict on the corner with a needle in his arm, and you've got all kinds of judgment. I understand that. We all judgment. We all talk about don't be judgmental, but humans judge. That's okay. Staying in the judgment is not so good. Now I say to you, well, what's your addiction? And you go, no, I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't do drugs. No, that's not what I asked you. I asked you, what's your addiction? Because addiction is a neurochemical response to something in avoidance of something else. Oh, I don't know. Is your addiction church? Is it volunteering? Is it being a workaholic? Is it being nice? What are your addictions that create the neurochemistry that are feeding in? So again, creating that marinade for your emotional source code. So you're just reinforcing it. Now, as you reinforce it, that's building your identity. So we're coming back up the ladder now. It's building your identity. So I say, well, what's your addiction? We find out, well, your addiction is being nice. So what's your identity? I'm nice. Well, what if this calls for you to not be nice? What if this calls for you to have healthy boundaries? What if this calls for you, if you're nice, you go, well, I can't do that. A healthy boundary is a healthy boundary. But to somebody who's addicted to nice, no, that's a wall. I can't do that. So now you're self-destructive in the process. And you say, oh, I've got to build better boundaries. You psychologically, cognitively understand you've got to build better boundaries, but you can't do it because it interferes with your identity. So if you don't deal with the identity, nothing changes. So identity is right at the core. It's the thing that holds the top end, meaning the beliefs, the values, and the behavior. Mm-hmm. And at the bottom end, it's reinforced by the emotional source code and the anatomy of meaning. So that was my thesis on this. And then I took that further and wrote the entire thesis on how this creates emotional resonance fields, which is a quantum understanding of how this works and why you keep attracting the same people over and over again with a new face.
Oh, man. I mean, you've taken
There's a lot to digest in there. I'm sorry. I know I just dumped.
No, I mean, it's to me, it's like you, I realize there's no one answer. There's a lot of connections that have to take place. And you have taken it to such a level of connectivity that it just, to me, just makes sense. And you've driven it to a deeper depth than I've gone before. And so it's enriching, it's fulfilling, it's amazing to go to the depths that you have to understand how this all is, because I mean, I've encountered so many clients and leaders throughout the years who, do exactly what you're saying. I want to change, but how do I do that? And I know a while back, I emphasized how you show up matters. Who do you want to be? And then, what's important to you, and how do you live that? How do you behave that? How do you be that? And it's an evolution of a process that takes place over this journey.
Absolutely, it is. And that willingness to confront that there's an identity. So, as you know, I work with these very high powered individuals who say they want to change, who write a very large check to work with me. And I say, here's the deal. In this process, it's not a quick process. We work together for a year so that's the commitment. You pay for that year. There's no refunds. In fact, I can fire you during that time. And what I say to you is, there's going to come a point here where if you don't say, at least in your own mind, F you, Dov, I've not done my job. And they go, what do you mean? I said, you're going to love me in the first 24 hours.
Yeah.
But about 2 to 3 months in, you're going to hate me because all those wonderful realizations and insights you've got are now going to have to be put in action. And it's going to challenge the shit out of your identity. And your identity is clinging. So let me make it clear to you. If I say to you, what's the most important thing in life to a human being? People will come up with all kinds of things. And I say, no, go more basic. And they go, I don't know. I go, it's life, right? You would think it's life, right? Because if you're a pacifist, but somebody tries to kill your children, you might turn into a murderer, right? So it's life itself. And people go, yeah. I go, what's more important than life? They go, I don't know. And I go, identity. And they go, how can you say that? Because if you would strap a bomb to yourself and blow yourself up and end your life to fulfill an identity, then identity is more important than life. That's how committed we are. So when I'm helping you to confront these demons, these dragons that are within you, to slay those dragons so that you can actually be you, bring home those disenfranchised policies, the magnificence that lies within you, for me to bring that home is going to require you to confront the shadow part of yourself, the parts of yourself that are so dark that you've disenfranchised them. And you're going to fight me on that. Not because you dislike me, not because you disagree with me, but because it feels like the very life of you is threatened. But when you do it, when you bring on those disenfranchised parts, you don't lose your success. It goes up. You just got a whole lot of different tools and a way different mechanism of driving you. Because when you talk about this whole thing around conflict and decoding conflict, if I want to decode conflict, I decode it in one sentence. What are you fighting for? Whatever you answer me, the answer is, that might be it, but here's what it really is. You're fighting for your identity. You're in conflict about your identity. Whatever you think this is, it's your identity. Well, I'm the smartest person in the room, so I can't listen to you. That's your identity. Well, I don't have anything to say, so I have to follow your rules. That's your identity. That's the argument. Well, I'm trying to be a loving person. That's your identity. So the conflict is decoded in you as in me, as in the individual, going, okay, if I'm not fighting about this, it appears I'm fighting about this, whatever this is, but I'm actually fighting for my identity. The question becomes, what part of my identity am I in conflict with this person about? Because it feels like they're threatening my identity. Then I go, oh, then I can step back and go, oh, well, what the first question is, well, are they actually threatening my identity? And the answer is usually no. It's like, oh, they actually don't know my identity. Why the hell would that's my shit? I'm making that up. Okay, great. So maybe I could listen. Yeah, maybe.
Absolutely. I find what you say so interesting, because so often, people are quick to point fingers and blame the other person. Well, it's because you did this, that I did this. And so it gets into this tit for tat called the merry-go-round of conflict. Where do you get off? It gets going so fast. And as you just emphasized, and I oftentimes illustrate, it's so important that we start with, how am I contributing to the situation? And is the conflict really between me and another person, or is it within me and I'm acting out on that in some ways because I am feeling threatened?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, I like to say we're in conflict. We teach conflict resolution. process. It's very different than most people's. But one of the things I say is, very simply, if you can just grasp for a moment that you're never arguing about what you think you're arguing about, right? That is just a surface trigger. And then you have to go, as you just said, you have to go internal. Like, what is this within me? What is this within me? When you get to that place, and the thing that will get you there is this. This is my religion, curiosity. You've got to be curious. You can't be right and curious. Right. So, there's old saying, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? No, I go, no, because happy is a whole other subject. But
it's a whole other subject.
A whole other subject. And I just say, do you want to be happy or do you want to be right or do you want to be curious? And the answer is you want to be right. That's what you're doing. But what if you chose to be curious? What if you chose to say, well, what if this? Tell me about that. I think you might know that in 2015, I was at the what's it called? Neurological flatulence. That's called a brain fart. I was at the UN speaking with a guy who I'd assisted, who was a white Aryan race guy. He was the head of war. He was a neo-Nazi. And as I was working with him, we ended up talking at the UN about the far right and what was happening. And this is in 2015, before Trump or any of that. We could see it coming on the wall. And they asked us in a panel, they said to me, how could you help him? And I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, he was advocating for the annihilation of your people because I'm born Jewish. And I said, well, it's very simple. When he came into my office, you would have seen a neo-Nazi. I said, when he sat down, he was very shameful, but he was still a neo-Nazi in his head, not in the outfit, not in the uniform, not in the group, but in his head. Like EO said, he left the movement, but the movement hadn't left him. And so I said, he sat down and we're 10 minutes in. I go, hey, Tony, I'm expensive. Don't waste the money here. Why are you here? So he puts his head down in great shame and he finally lifts his head and says, he tells me about him being a neo-Nazi, a Holocaust denier, blah, blah, blah. And he's very shameful and very heavy. And he looks up at me and I've got this big Cheshire cat grin. And he goes, like, now he's gotten mad, right? He's gone from shame to mad. And he goes, why are you laughing? And I go, you do know I'm a Jew, right? And he looks at me and goes, oh, effing irony.
Oh.
And we became friends. And so the person at the UN said to me, but how could you help him? I still don't understand. I said, because you were seeing a neo-Nazi. He became that at 15. I said, I can remember 15. He was a highly articulate, highly intelligent, funny guy. He needed a place to feel like he belonged and a place where that mattered. I said, I had the same. I was a highly articulate, funny, intellectual guy who thought things that other people didn't think and had no place to go. We just chose different paths. That's all. We just had different options placed in front of us. Now that guy is now the founder of Life After Hate. He's the founder of The Cure for Hate. He's written a best-selling book called The Cure for Hate. He speaks around the world at Holocaust museums. He speaks in synagogues. He and I have spoken in synagogues together. They made an award-winning movie about his trip back to Auschwitz. We're looking at people in what they do instead of what's inside of them that's repressed. That's the disenfranchised parts. Mm-hmm. His soul, he talks about it himself. He says his soul was disenfranchised. And he says, I couldn't have compassion for anybody else because I had none for myself. And he said, the work with Dov, I was brought home to the compassion for myself, which I only had shame and ridicule. But coming back to that has now turned him into an advocate for this wonderful things in the world. So It's not looking at people as what they do, but what's inside. And then you flip the mirror on yourself and you go, okay, well, what if that's me? Like, I think I'm this dirtbag, or I think I'm this incredibly successful person, but what else is in there? Because these disenfranchised parts are this treasure chest of magnificence that you get to use in your life in the way you want to make the difference you want. And so you can be a billionaire and still feel like it's empty.
Crap.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's just that got you to that place. Now what's next is that depth. And I know that that's the work you do, and I know that's the work in the conflict, and that's what I love and appreciate about the work that you're doing, and it's the difference you're making. Because if we don't deal with conflict, particularly today in this world, we're going, the old term, going to hell in a handbasket, right? So
Yeah.
we've really got to come back to, I'm a member of a group called called It Starts With Us. It was started by Daniel Lubetsky of Kind Bars, and it's
Hmm.
very far right and very far left. And I say I am firmly planted in the middle. I am an extreme centrist because I cannot work out how to be on either side of that. If we bring together, we can build bridges and recognize how much we have in common. Some of my closest friends are Republicans. I'm not. Some of my closest friends are Christians. I'm not. It's like, I have nothing against those things,
Hmm.
right? Some of my friends are go to the World Economic Forum. I'm not exactly a fan of that, but I cannot love them. I can
Yeah.
understand them. I can understand what's driving them because I can see their emotional source code. And it's like, okay, I can have
Yeah.
compassion for you now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you have just framed it in such an articulate way. I'm just really impressed to be able to share your framework. I'm going to use that word again with
Mhm.
all of our listeners, because when I think of decoding the conflict mindset, you use the word curious, and I oftentimes will say, it takes courage to be curious,
It
and
does
yet it
indeed.
takes curiosity to be courageous.
It's a loop. You're absolutely right. It's a loop.
Yep. Yeah. And another metaphor I use a lot to help people quickly understand the depth that you're talking about, because so often we do affix labels, and like you say, judgment. We all judge to some degree.
Of
It's
course
what
we
you
do.
do with the judgment, that makes the difference. And being aware that, oh, I have a judgment, I have a bias here. But many times, like we were talking about with your neo-Nazi, that's a label, and it puts it into a box of people, and it makes it very discreet rather than more again, well, in conflict we oftentimes say don't separate the person from the problem. Okay,
Exactly.
the person is not the problem, the behavior is the problem. So how do we deal with that, and recognize that this is a human being that has all kinds of needs? And you talked about the need for inclusion, and that is so prevalent. We have that social need, that emotional need to be included, to be part of something, to be accepted. And that's why people gravitate towards groups to where they have like-mindedness, but there's dangers in that too. And
Of
so
course. Human
yeah.
beings are tribal. We need to belong. But here's the thing to understand as you listen to this. It is within you. It is a desire within you to belong. You are a tribal being. That's who we are. But we trade belonging for fitting in.
Yes.
That's really important for you to grasp because those are things are
Mhm.
very different. Because in order to fit in, you must distort yourself, you must pretzel yourself to fit in. When you belong, it's a place of home. You are welcome
Yeah.
with all, warts and all. And that's so people are gravitating towards groups because they're so desperately lonely, particularly after the pandemic. I think they were very lonely before. They just got to recognize it. And so they are gravitating towards these groups, but they're not actually getting validated at a soulful level. So they act out more inside the group to get more validation. So the louder you scream inside the group about your nonsense, the group's nonsense, the more I'm aware that you're not feeling like you belong. And you might be the leader of the group, but you're not
Right.
feeling like you belong because belonging is vastly, vastly different than fitting in. And we,
Right.
as leaders in the world today, have a responsibility to build business cultures of belonging. In my last book, Fiercely Loyal, I talked about the 4 C's. And in the fourth C was community. And I said, you've got to build communities.
Mhm.
Now, what I say is that's the first, not the last.
Yeah.
Build a community and put a business in it. Don't build a
Yeah.
business and build a community on it. Like, build a community first. People need a place to belong, and those are your employees, those are your customers, those are the people who serve you, whatever it is. Give people
Mhm.
room to breathe and without making things wrong, so
Mhm.
we can see our commonality. Because you
Right.
you know you saw that video I put up, I think, where I talked
Right.
about the neo-Nazis and the transgender people who hate each other, and then suddenly, because they don't know that about each other, they're having a conversation over a beer about something else, and it's like, wow, yeah, we've got things in common. I hate these
Wow.
people, and then finding out from their DNA test, oh, you're partially that. So, like, for me, that's beautiful. It's
Yeah.
such a beautiful gift to realize that all these ideas about differences are made up, just like the bloody borderlines are made up. And it's fine. I'm not saying we should crash all the borders or forget all the borders, or that we should forget all those labels, but we should understand that there's surface.
Yeah.
Below all that is, you're a woman, you're a man, you love people, I love people, you're gay, you're straight, you're Christian, you're Muslim, you love people, I love people, there are people you love. Are there
Mhm.
some shitbags in the world? Of course there are. But there's not many. I promise you, there's far less than you think. You just might be
Right.
bumping into them a lot, right? The
Mhm.
few. And that might be on your emotional source code, because it's there to remind you of what you don't want to be. Some of your greatest teachers in life are the people who did things you hate, because they're reminding you not to live that way. I have
Right.
often said one of my greatest teachers was my dad. People go, oh, was he a very spiritual man? No, he was a narcissistic asshole who punched me in the
Yeah.
face when I was 9 months old, right? Who had no spiritual background, who was disconnected from everybody. What a great teacher. I
Hmm.
hell don't want to be that. I don't
Yeah.
not interested in being that. My mother was a neurotic, bipolar individual who couldn't get her shit together, right? Well, I don't want to be that either. But was
Yeah.
there beauty in those people? Of course there was. Can I
Mhm.
find that beauty and elicit that from within myself? Of course. So it's not that you are trying to polarize your parents, or because we often, human beings operate in polarity. We either do exactly what they did and tell these bullshit stories about my perfect family, which is absolute
Mhm.
bullshit, or my family were terrible. But there's gifts in both. There's gifts in both, and you can only see those gifts when you examine it as a whole. Human beings are multifaceted. Every person you meet, like I will often say, I'm an enlightened asshole, right? It just depends on the moment. And we all are, right? You've sat
We
down with a
all have
3
our
year old kid
moments.
who said, like, you go, what the hell? Did Gandhi just come through this kid? That's the same kid who takes a shit on your rug. That's the same kid who puts their sticky fingers all over your window. Well, it's a great example of multifacetism. We just repress more as we get older.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that's the beauty. I mean, Dov, you have said so many wonderful things, and have echo much more eloquently than I do some of my similar thoughts and beliefs. And I'd love to share more. I mean, they heard about your background before we started our interview, and they'll hear a little bit more. But if there's one or two things that you'd absolutely want to share with our community right now, as far as maybe one or two steps that they can take, one or two resources that you have, what would those be?
Well, as a resource, I mean, as you know, you can find me everywhere. Dov Baron is, Dovbaron. If you put that in, you're not going to find anybody else doing that. I'm on LinkedIn, of course, which is the main place I hang out social wise. Also on Instagram and Twitter. I have a YouTube channel with over 1,000 videos on it. I have 2 podcasts. One is called Leadership and Loyalty, which is the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 listeners. And I have a podcast called Curiosity Bites, which is my polymathic one, which is neuroscience, it is theology, it's all kinds of wonderful things. So you can find those. I also have a brand new course out. It's on coursifyx.com. So spell the word course and then and then the letter x.com/belonging. And that actually talks about building a culture of belonging. But let me just be clear here. You go, well, I don't run a corporation, or I'm not in HR, I'm not in human development. Listen, you could go through that course with nobody under you, because it is, in fact, a leadership course for an individual who then is going to apply it into an organization. So Coursifyx with the letter X.com/belonging. That's where you can find my course. There's a wicked deal on right now. It's only because it's just been released. So I can't guarantee it'll be there long, but go and have a look at that. So that's one of the great resources. I have a bunch of books. You can find those on Amazon. I think there's 13 of them, and other places. And I know I'm insane, but here you go. My email address, my direct email address is Dov, D-O-V, at dovbaron.com. You can write to me. In fact, I encourage you to write to me. In fact, I don't encourage you, I challenge you to write to me, and I'll tell you why. Because Deborah puts all the time and effort. I told you I have 2 podcasts. I know what it takes. It oftentimes it's a bloody one-way street. You put all this effort and energy in, and you don't really know if you have an impact. So I want you to write to me, and I want you to tell me what you got out of this and what you're going to do with it. I want you to write to Deborah, to Dr. Dupree, and tell her what you got out of it. You can do it on LinkedIn. You can do it on a social media platform. You can email her, whatever it is. But you need to tell her so she knows, because she puts all the time and energy to bring these people to you. And believe me, we're not free we're in the real world, right? There's a lot of, cost involved here. We're giving you this. I want you to be able to use it. So write to us. Tell us what you got, number 1. Tell us what you're going to do with it, more importantly, number 2. And number 3, share it with others. Don't hoard. Be in an abundant mindset. If we're going to make the world less conflictual, if we're going to find grace and honor and love with each other, we got to share that message instead of the shit that's going out on traditional media that's telling us we need to be in conflict. We need to share these messages out there with others. And you need to let Deborah know that you appreciate her, that you appreciate this. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to go to wherever you're tuning into this podcast from, even if it's on YouTube or wherever it is. I want you to rate, review, and subscribe. So you're going to write something, you're going to rate it, and you're going to subscribe, and then you're going to share it with other people. Because the more people who get this message, the bigger the difference we can make in the world. And it's thanks to people like Dr. Deborah Dupree that change is taking place. Don't believe the hype, the negative hype. It's a sequel. We've all heard it before. Don't believe the hype. It's a sequel. It's negative nonsense. We've all been there, especially people like Deborah and I who are over 30. Oh, sorry.
I love it.
We've seen this before. It's not new to us. It might be new to you if you're in your 20s or your 30s, but it's not new. Don't believe it. We can make the shift. We can make the difference, but we've got to get out of our bubble. Don't follow the crappy advice, which is spend time with like-minded people. Terrible advice. Don't spend time with like-minded people. Spend time with people who don't think like you, and then get curious. So instead of saying you're an idiot, say, tell me why you believe that. That's interesting. I'm fascinated. How do you come to that conclusion? Oh, the earth is flat. All right. Well, in your head, you might be going, this person's insane. But you go, okay, tell me how you get to that. Tell me how you get to that mindset. When that documentary came out on YouTube, I was excited to watch it. My wife's like, why do you want to watch this? It's crazy. I went, I want to understand why somebody would think that way. Yeah. Like, what is that? And by that curiosity, I can learn. There's no learning without curiosity. There's no curiosity without courage. There's no courage until you're willing to confront your own identity. Deborah, thank you so much. You're a rock star, girl.
Well, Dov, you've been just a wonderful, wonderful host, guest, and I'm so proud to be hosting you here. I mean, prolific messages, and thank you for the challenge to the world, to the community, and thank you for all that you do, and please don't ever stop.
Well, it's only been about 40 years, so I'm not likely to.
Very good. Okay. Well, our viewers and listeners, you have just had one heck of a show with Dov Baron right now, and it does cost a lot of money. So what you got is free, and so do pass it on, share the message, grow and shape the world differently as we move forward. So thank you for being here again. Share this podcast, get it out there, and come back and see us real soon. Dr. Deborah Dupree, transforming confrontations into conversations. Well, that was one powerful interview with Dov Baron. I've learned so much in getting to know him and learning about his emotional source code. It has taken us to a much deeper level about really understanding the message that drives people and then how to manage the people in the message. His work is fascinating in terms of what he's done to understand people like Putin, like Trump, and many others. Make sure that you download his free book from his website and learn more, but particularly around the fascinating subject of his analysis of Mr. Putin. coming up next in 2 weeks. So make sure that you subscribe, put it on your calendar, 12:30 p.m. Pacific time, because next you will hear from Deb Cryer. Deb was a highly successful businesswoman working in Fortune 500 companies when her life totally changed, when the big C became part of her life. Well, what she's gone on to do is not only share her story, but also serve as a coach to help people transition through that difficult time, particularly when it impacts their life, their work, their family, their homes. So Deb has tremendous insights from having been there firsthand. So please come on back, share this podcast episode coming up in 2 weeks with your friends, families, and others who have dealt with the big C. I'm Dr. Deborah Dupree. I'm delighted to bring to you these fascinating topics. Please join our DCM community and spread the word.